Good morning, church. Our scripture reading this morning will be in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 3. Proverbs 23. It is an honor for a man to keep aloof from strife, but every fool will be quarreling.
Good morning, everyone. I had an introduction to this sermon that I set up a few weeks ago, or last week, but after the events of the Oscars, it would probably work even better to talk about that. So the sermon today is talking about quarreling, talking about arguing and fighting, and it's a conduct unbecoming of a Christian. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie A Few Good Men. It's a movie in the mid-'90s where Tom Cruise and Kevin Bacon and Jack Nicholson, and they're all military people. And in that process, there's a Willie Santiago who's a young private, who's a subpar private in the Marines. And in that process, he's trying to get off the base and writes letters out of chain of command to try to get himself transferred off of the base. And in the code of the Corps, that didn't set very well. And so his own platoon, led by his own people, led by two gentlemen, a Lance Corporal Dawson and a Private First Class Downey, they lead to what is called a Code Red. And he ends up dying. And so in the movie, there's this trial of these two gentlemen to find out if they were just following orders or they were guilty of homicide or murder. And the final scene is the courtroom scene, which they're going to decide the fate of these two young men. And there's three charges. There's charge of murder, there's accessory to murder, and there's charge of a conduct unbecoming a Marine. And I'm not going to tell you what the conduct or what the final is, so I don't spoil it for you. But in that process, the conduct unbecoming a Marine was the greatest punishment for these two men that they felt, more than murder, because they were being taken away what they believed to be their code of conduct as Marines. And so they were charged with unbecoming a Marine, discharged dishonorably from the Corps. How often do we as Christians have conduct that is unbecoming a Christian? And as I was asked to teach about Proverbs, I began to look at the Proverbs and I began to look, what are the Proverbs truly about? And the more I studied and looked at the Proverbs, I realized that the Proverbs are about wisdom. And how do we learn to become godly people? Life happens. Life's tough. Difficulties we have with different things like money, friend problems, gossip, anger, worldly possessions, all of those things come into our lives, and the Proverbs are ways to teach us how do we handle those things in a God-honoring manner. And so that's what wisdom is about. Because I believe wisdom, as we see it in Proverbs, is about becoming or having or developing the ability to cope with life in a God-honoring way. Hence the title, A Conduct Becoming a Christian. So then, it's not about being smart. It's about making wise choices. Because we know that smart people sometimes make really stupid choices. So which proverb do you stop on? I mean, that was my biggest challenge. Which proverb do I stop on in trying to develop this unbecoming or this conduct becoming a Christian? And I read, which is the most important? Which is the hardest to do? Which is the most needed? You just keep looking through them, and there's just so many there. So I stopped on this one. Keep away from strife is an honor for man, but any fool will quarrel. Proverbs 20, verse 3. And the reason I stopped on it is because I read a bunch of them in the New Testament or in Proverbs about it, And quarreling just jumped out. This one, I love a couple of them. Let me read just a couple of them. Whoever meddles in a quarrel, not his own, is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears. For lack of wood, a fire goes out, and where there is no whisper of quarreling, or quarreling ceases. So it's something that's very prominent in Proverbs, but the more I read in the New Testament, it's something that's very prominent in the New Testament as well, and so often we forget about it. So I believe that quarreling or arguing, or however you want to describe that term, which I'll explain that in just a minute, is all about a conduct that we really struggle with. We struggle with it as a people. A nation is seen as a nation that's in quarreling, bickering, and arguing all the time. We struggle that as people. We struggle that as a brotherhood at times, becoming a brotherhood that's often recognized to be one of quarreling and contending with one another. So we often see conduct unbecoming of a Christian. But it starts out, and when we look at quarreling, it starts out as just this simple conversation. And then as you have this conversation, you may add just a little bit of salt to that conversation, which might become something like, whoa, I took that personally. And once I took it personally, it goes from a conversation to a disagreement. And then as you keep talking about this disagreement, add a little bit of anger or jealousy or frustration to that, and it becomes a debate. And to the debate, you may add a little bit more seasoning. And it becomes about what I want or what I believe versus what you have to say. And it turns into an argument. And then finally, it ends up being a fight. And so we see that this progression in our lives, it's often the fact that we have added other things to a conversation that have taken it to a quarrel. Proverbs 17:14 says, the start of a quarrel is like a leak in a dam. So stop it before it bursts. So how would you define a quarrel? Ran across a definition of quarrel, which I really like. It says a heated argument, typically about a trivial issue between two people who are usually on good terms. An argument or a discussion about an argument or heated argument about something trivial between two people who are usually on good terms. And another couple of definitions I read that when we talk about quarreling and they define quarreling, that at some point in that disagreement or that argument, there is a temporary or permanent separation or destruction of relationship. So quarreling is a discussion, argument, that somehow puts strife or difficulty between one another. Of people who usually agree with each other or like each other. There's a couple of Greek words that are used, and I'm not going to go into the Greek, but they translate it strife, argue, complaint, contend, dispute, grudge, to make war, or to fight. And so what we see that quarreling is more the verbal fight than the physical fight. And so we run into those issues. But quarreling, as the message says, is the mark of good character. Not quarreling is the mark of good character. But surprisingly enough, it's not just an Old Testament proverb. If you look at Romans 13, verse 13, Paul begins to talk to the brethren there, and he says, let us walk properly in the daytime, not in orgies, not in drunkenness, not in sexual immorality or sensuality, not in quarreling, not in jealousy. It surprised me that when I looked at Romans, Paul equates quarreling or disputing or arguing with sexual immorality. They're all on the same line for him. So how serious is it to God? When Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and he's going to come see them, and he's sharing his concern and his desire to make sure that when he gets there, they're going to be living the way God calls them to live. Hope he finds them in that way in 2 Corinthians 12:20. And the first thing that he wants to make sure they're not doing is quarreling. When you talk about leaders in the church, One of the qualities of the godly men who are supposed to lead the church and be the elders of the church is that they must not be quarrelsome. So it's a characteristic that it's not only a proverb, it's a characteristic in the New Testament that teaches us this is character, this is a way of being that is not becoming of a Christian if we're quarrelsome. So let me ask you this. Why is it so hard not to be quarrelsome? Or you may disagree. Is it easy to be not quarrelsome? James 4, when he talks in James 4, and here's what he says. He says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? It is not it is not this, that your passions are raging war within you. You desire and do not to have, so you murder. You covet, you cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. So you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask for wrong motives. So James lets them know that the reason that this quarreling is such a big issue is the fact that there's this internal conflict in us. I did some research in it. And I love the way the Message says it. They come about because you want your own way and fight deep inside yourself. Why is quarreling such a great challenge for us? Because in the research, they've done some studies and they put probes on people and they monitor their heart rates and they monitor their blood pressure, and they've watched the neurology behind arguing. And they found that as we begin to argue and as we challenge each other in arguing and as we win an argument, our system, our brain, is pumped with dopamine. And dopamine is the drug of pleasure. So every time you win, you want to repeat that because your body says that felt good. So it's so hard because this internal fight within us says that your body likes that feeling of winning. The second reason that it's such a difficulty is because in that difficulty, we see that we are selfish and self-centered. It says that we want more things. We want to do more things for ourselves. We want to have more pleasures. We want more power. We want more prestige. We want more popularity because we want friendships with the world. And friendships with the world are against God. So not only is there this war waging inside of us that actually makes us feel good to win arguments, there's also this desire inside of us to do what we choose to do. And finally, James is saying that there's pride involved in that. There's pride involved in that because we don't ask or we ask for the wrong motives. We don't want to stop arguing because we have the pride that keeps us from doing so. So we've seen that quarreling is not becoming of a Christian. It's hard because of all the internal stuff. So how do we stop quarreling? I think there's 4 steps that we go in our lives that we can teach us and take us to stop quarreling. And they may seem extremely simple, but I guarantee they're extremely hard, as most of us could say. The first step is when we look at stopping these attitudes and these things that are unbecoming of a Christian, the first thing we have to learn to focus our eyes. When we are in an argument or we are in a discussion, at some point in that discussion, when it goes from just this conversation to the debate, and from the debate to the arguing, the quarrel, or the fight, at some point in that discussion, we begin to change our focus about those who we're discussing with. They no longer become a friend or a brother or fellow Christian. They become the enemy or the one who stands opposed. And so once you make that switch, it's about they become the one who's trying to hurt me or the one who's trying to make me or prove me wrong. They are the enemy. So we have to learn to refocus our minds and our eyes on what God says. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16, it says, "From now on we no longer see people according to worldly measures. We don't see people based on what we think they're about. We see them through the eyes of Christ. So as we learn to do this, we have to learn to refocus that is not my enemy. That is not the person who's opposed to me. That is my brother or sister in Christ. Or that is someone who needs to know about Christ. And the second thing is focusing our eyes is so often, and I've done this, and maybe you have too, that as soon as you're done with a discussion or a debate, you turn and walk away, and then in your mind, you start listing all the negative things about the person you're arguing with. We start looking at those negative things in our lives, in their lives, and what's going on, and how bad they are, and how negative they become, and those qualities. But Philippians says, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, commendable, think on these things. So refocusing our mind is changing what we look at, changing on the way we see people, the changing on what we concentrate on. Not that they're our enemies, but that they're the in person who we share with. Not all their negative characteristics, but their positive ones. And that will help us refocus our quarrels. The second thing we have to learn to do, now we've got our eyes. The second thing is our ears. Gary Chapman, a marriage counselor and writer, he did a study, or he found a study, but he published the results, and it says that most of us wait 16 seconds before we give our opinion. So if you start talking to somebody, or someone starts talking to you, it takes only 16 seconds before you open your mouth. So then, we have to do what James says. To be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. So as we learn about these challenges and these difficulties of being people who are becoming godly people for Christ, it becomes about stopping our mouth from speaking first and opening our ears to hear what is said. We must become true listeners to stop arguments, because it takes two to argue. The third thing we have to do in this process of becoming godly men and women in our lives and taking quarreling out of our lives is we have to learn to watch our mouths. How quickly does our vocabulary go from conversation to accusation, to deterioration, or accusing, or saying things that are like stupid. That's a stupid idea. That's an idiotic thing. That's ridiculous. That's dumb. And we begin to use words that degrade the other people in those arguments, in those discussions. But Paul says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building up. So as we learn in this process of becoming godly Christians, or living this life that is becoming what God says we need to do, if we'll watch our mouths, we will learn to be wise in how we confront one another. So we've got our eyes, we've got our ears, we've got our mouth. What's next? Our steps, our actions. We must seek to be people of reconciliation. There's a phrase, and I'm a lover, not a fighter. I went on the internet to figure out where that came from, and to be honest with you, I didn't find it. But there's a pretty good debate on where this phrase comes from. I'm a lover, not a fighter. You ever heard the phrase? Okay, it's pretty well known. Some people even said it would go all the way back to the Greeks. Don't know. Not the point for today. But the point is that we need to be lovers, not fighters. We need to be about sharing and caring and reconciling one another, not about fighting and separating and dividing one another. We live in a society that is divided. We live in a society that's looking for a fight. We live in a society that political debates are all about disagreements and arguments. We live in the shadow of centuries and generations of Christians who fought. We live in a society that you have to take your stand and be opposed to something. But 2 Corinthians tells us that God did all things through Christ to reconcile humanity to himself. And then he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. If we want to be people of conduct, becoming a Christian and not be quarrelsome, we must understand that we have to be people that search and seek and strive for reconciliation, not separation. First to God, and then to one another. So to sum it all up, as Christians, God says, Old Testament, New Testament, and throughout, quarrelsome is a conduct, or arguing is a conduct not becoming of a Christian. So therefore, let's not be dishonorably discharged because of our conduct. Let us strive to focus our eyes, open our ears, watch our mouths, and take steps of reconciliation.